Hello, everyone. I had a request to do some videos on C.S. Lewis, which I don't do, but I thought it would be okay. I could maybe point out a couple of things about the text that I think are important. This is obviously a different sort of work than the things that we've been reading. It's not a scholarly work on death. It doesn't have any fundamental thesis, any obvious fundamental thesis that it's trying to establish. It's an entirely different sort of thing. It's a journal that Lewis kept during the time immediately following the death of his wife, who is continually referred to as H in the book. It's also, I would like to say, probably the best thing that we read besides Plato's Phaedo. I mean, not, philosophically the most important or even the most insightful, but one of the reasons that I haven't done videos about this is that it's too good. It's probably one of the three or four things, in my opinion, that everybody should read about death. But it's not the kind of thing where I feel like as a teacher I have any particular insight into or can give you much help in reading, and you don't need help in reading this. It's incredibly readable. That's why I think it's a kind of a small, minor masterpiece, really. You don't need to watch videos about this book. But then again, you don't need to watch videos about any book. You can just read what I've asked you to read. But so that's why I don't do videos for Lewis. I really don't think that I have much to offer, but I think that the students' request is entirely fair when I think about it. If the videos are helping anybody, then they should probably have videos on a book. But so don't expect too much, is what I'm trying to say out of this. I mean, you simply have to read it, and it's a wonderful book. But let me make a video. If I make more than one video, great. But there are a couple things here and there that I think are important, but they're just things that I think are important. I can't give you any special insight into the book, but here goes. Yes, the opening is incredible. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Or perhaps, yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. I mean, I guess reading it through this time around, it's just it's so obvious that he's depressed that anybody can see that. And perhaps, that is how we would evaluate it today. And, okay, somebody's depressed and here are all the symptoms, fluttering in the stomach, feeling like there's a kind of a wall between you and the rest of the world, being uninterested in things. Yeah. So he's depressed. What's amazing about it is there's just so much more to say, right? Than somebody's depressed. I mean, in certain ways, when we just say that I'm depressed or someone else is depressed in our age, it's just a way of kind of avoiding really finding out what the problem is, or really finding out what's going on with somebody. One of the things that I'd like you to do in reading Lewis is to keep Gustafsons Grief in mind. One of the reason that I pair these two things, not the only reason. I think that there's every reason to read this book, no matter what you read it with. But We remember Gustafson's definition of grief, G, which is quite important, right? That grief consists of a certain belief, that a cognitive belief that someone is dead. It consists of certain feelings, of sadness, anger, anxiety, etc. These just basically unhappy feelings. And that there's this third element, which is the element of desire, what he calls the belief counter desire that someone not be dead, which is why he believes that grief is to grieve is basically to be in an irrational state, because what you know is totally incompatible with what you want, and yet you keep wanting that thing, even though it's completely, that it's completely impossible. So that in a certain way, to be grieving in Gustafson's sense of grieving, or his claim about what grieving is to be in an irrational state. It doesn't mean it's irrational to grieve, but in any case, one of the interesting things that I would like you to do in reading this book is to think about to what extent Lewis's actual experience bears out Gustafson's theoretical, philosophical definition of grief. Whether you see that, that definition in Lewis's grief, or whether you don't. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, my goodness, depression. Here we are on page 5. And no one ever told me about the laziness of grief, except at my job, where the machine seems to run on much as usual. I loathe the slightest effort. Not only writing, but even reading a letter is too much, even shaving. What does it matter now whether my cheek is rough or smooth? They say an unhappy man wants distractions, something to take him out of himself. Only as a dog-tired man wants an extra blanket on a cold night. He'd rather lie there shivering than get up and find one. It's easy to find, or it's easy to see why the lonely become untidy, finally dirty, and disgusting. Wow. More depression, okay. But in the next sentence, you sort of, some of the themes of the book really begin to emerge, and that is, meanwhile, where is God? And, one of the other questions that I'd like you to keep in mind when reading this book is, this is the grief of a person who is definitely a believer. And one of the attendant beliefs, or one of the parts of being a believer for Lewis is really believing that his wife still exists, that his wife has not become nothing, that she still has being, that death is not Epicurean death, that death is something more like Christian or Platonic, but in his case, obviously Christian death. But the main thing is that he is approaching grief, or he is experiencing grief, or undergoing grief as a Christian. And one of the strong parts of that Christian belief is that his wife still exists. And one of the questions I'd like you to think about in going through the book is, does that make his grief easier, or does that make his grief harder? And that's a question. I mean, I'm not weighing in, or I may weigh in, but I don't have a definitive idea of which one of those things is true. But I think that one cannot read this book without entertaining the thought, because I think he almost explicitly comes out with it, that things would be easier if he just thought that she didn't exist at all, that her existence was entirely over. And like I said, I don't think the answer to the question whether his Christianity makes his grief easier or harder has an obvious answer, but I think you would need to entertain both sides to really read the book honestly. And obviously there are parts of it that I think that indicate that, and I think they're quite obvious. But he does, especially in this first chapter, really feel that God God has abandoned him. He cannot, or he cannot find God, in his time of need. Um, uh, but that it's different, right? Here's on page 8, interesting remark. After the death of a friend years ago, I had for some time a most vivid feeling of certainty about his continued life, even his enhanced life. I have begged to be given 100th part of the same assurance about H. There is no answer, only the locked door, the iron curtain, the vacuum, absolute zero. Them as asks don't get. I was a fool to ask. For now, even if that assurance came, I should distrust it. I should think it is self hypnosis induced by my own prayer. So there is a sense in which he has to admit that he does doubt that she still exists. But again, it was easier with people he didn't care as much for to believe that they still exist. And here, there's this question of the rope, the house of cards that comes up later on. That his belief in God, and not just belief in the existence of God, but his belief in the goodness of God. That it was all very easy when it came to people that he wasn't that close to, or that he didn't need as much. All of these things seem to fall apart very easily when it comes to losing his wife, the person that he's closest to, the person that he needs the most. And then he talks about his faith being a kind of a house of cards that's so easily kicked over when it's really tested. And the rope, that when you really need a rope to keep you from falling to your death, that's when you really have to ask yourself whether the rope is sound, whether the rope is strong. So those metaphors. Um, Obviously, you should read this. This is all great stuff. I don't have to comment on everything interesting, but there's one thing I wanted to get to. I think it's in chapter 2. So let me find that. Uh, One of the things that he's really has a lot of anxiety about is whether he's remembering her correctly. Like he talks about not having a really good picture of her, and being worried that he's not remembering her correctly. And there's a lot of anxiety about that. And I think that's quite interesting. Um, that is, why would it be so important to remember her face correctly, or to remember her manner, the way she was correctly? I think that the anxiety about memory is quite interesting, especially as it relates to the soundness of his belief that she still exists. If she still exists, then it's really not that important that he remember her that really correctly, right? But if she doesn't exist, then it is. So there is that interplay between those two things. But I think it's also connected with his longing for her. That what does he really want at this point? An interesting remark here on page 19, where he says, "Today I had to meet a man I haven't seen for 10 years, and all that time I had thought I was remembering him well, how he looked and spoke and the sort of things he said. The first 5 minutes of the real man shattered the image completely. Not that he had changed. On the contrary, I kept on thinking, yes, of course. I'd forgotten that he thought that, or disliked this, or knew so and so, or jerked his head back that way. I had known all these things once, and I recognized them the moment I met them again, but they had all faded out of my mental picture of him. And when they were all replaced by his actual presence, the total effect was quite astonishingly different from the image I had carried about with me for those 10 years. The notion that we can think that we know people or that we remember them as they are, but their living presence immediately corrects all that. It's not that we're totally wrong. It's just that we had missed all this stuff. Oh, yeah, they're really like that. Yeah, yeah. Um, That is, there's no replacement for the living presence of a person, whether it's a person, I mean, any person in your life. And he continues, how can I hope that this will not happen to my memory of H? That it is not happening already, slowly, quietly, like snowflakes, like the small flakes that come when it is going to snow all night. Little flakes of me, my impressions, my selections are settling down on the image of her. The real shape will be quite hidden in the end. 10 minutes, 10 seconds of the real H would correct all this. And yet, even if those 10 seconds were allowed me, 1 second later the little flakes would begin to fall again. The rough, sharp, cleansing tang of her otherness is gone. That is, I think, a very interesting idea, that's anxiety of memory and what it's all about. I do think it's connected up with his belief or the question of her continuing existence after death, but it's also an articulation of what he has lost. Of course, he remembers her, but what does that mean? This metaphor of the snowflakes, the idea that her image is being continually covered up with, well, it's called forgetting, parts of him and are coming between him and who she was. And that's natural and inevitable, and that inevitably he will become more and more distant from the real her, because you need that living presence of a person to remind you of what they're really like. Well, as he says then below that, what pitiable cant, nonsense, to say she will live forever in my memory. Live, that's exactly what she won't do. And I think that he's completely right. People don't live in our memories. Our memories live in our memories. And of course, our memories are associated with the living person, but our memories are not the living person. So, yeah. Like, what does he want? I mean, here's this great thing about the story about the guy going to tend his mother's grave, and this whole thing about how his mother's grave has like become his mother to them, and how much Lewis dislikes that whole thing. And, he doesn't want a symbol of his wife. He doesn't want a memory of her. He doesn't want a monument to her. He wants her. That's what he's longing for. And this brings up one of the more interesting parts of the book, I think, is that, that what he really wants is at odds with his religious belief, right? Because, I mean, okay, he does ask himself whether she really exists. And I got to tell you, ultimately, he doesn't have much doubt about that. That is, he does believe that his wife has not become nothing. He doesn't believe in the Epicurean view of death. The question is, really, does that help? That is, if what you want, and maybe this is, kind of where Gustafson comes in most prominently, if what you want really is completely at odds with what you know to be true, then I don't know. I mean, if you know to be true that your wife still exists and is with God, right? But what you really want is her back now, the way she used to be with you, then that's a particularly difficult position, state to be in. On page 23, he says, but there are other difficulties. Where is she now? That is, in what place is she at the present time? But if H is not a body, and the body I loved is certainly no longer she is in no place at all. And the present time is a date or point in our time series. It is as if she were on a journey without me, and I said, looking at my watch. I wonder, is she at Houston right now? Or Euston right now? I think it's a train station in England. But unless she's proceeding at 60 seconds a minute along this same timeline that all we living people travel by, what does that now mean? If the dead are not in time or not in our sort of time, is there any clear difference when we speak of them between was and is and will be? I mean, I think those are great questions, and questions that really anybody who believes in an afterlife and anybody who believes in the continuing existence of the dead should ask themselves or should think about. Well, what does it mean that they are still? I mean, well, they're not in a place, right? Because they're not bodies anymore. So the question, where are they, probably doesn't make any sense. And they're not in time, at least in the kind of time that we're used to, right? And that might be a little more difficult to comprehend, but if you think about it, I think it's correct. So we say that we say that they still exist, but they certainly are not in any place or are not at any point in time. So we kind of admit that we have no idea what we're talking about, which doesn't mean we should give up the belief that the dead still exist in some form. But we should admit that we really have no idea what we're talking about. Lewis continues and says, kind people have said to me, she is with God. In one sense, that is most certain. She is, like God, incomprehensible and unimaginable. Right? So this sense of distance or absence or unreachability, the sense of complete lack of connection with his wife. I don't know. Is it different from a materialist point of view, which would say, like Epicurus, that the person simply didn't exist? To think that someone still exists, but that they're incomprehensible and unimaginable is, I don't know. Is that easier? Is that worse? Is that better than believing that they simply don't exist anymore? I don't know. But here's I think, a key part of the book. But I find that this question, however important it may be in itself, is not, after all, very important in relation to grief. Suppose that the earthly lives she and I shared for a few years are in reality only the basis for, or prelude to, or earthly appearance of two unimaginable, supercosmic, eternal somethings. He's talking about the soul. He's talking about the eternal aspect of human beings. That a person who has a religious viewpoint, not just Christian, but any religious viewpoint that sort of believes in such a thing as an eternity for the person, that we exist. We've always existed, and we always will exist. But right now we exist in this earthly form. But what's important about us is our souls, our spirit. He continues and says those somethings could be pictured as spheres or globes. Where the plane of nature cuts through them, that is, in earthly life, they appear as two circles. Circles are slices of spheres. So we can think of our souls having this grand eternal existence, but our earthly lives being that point at which the spheres are circles, two-dimensional. Two circles that touch, that's an important thing. That is, in his relationship with H, they were two circles, but they touched. But those two circles, above all, the point at which they touched, are the very thing I am mourning for, homesick for, famished for. You tell me, she goes on. But my heart and body are crying out, come back, come back. Be a circle, touching my circle on the plane of nature. But I know this is impossible. I know that the thing I want is exactly the thing I can never get. Well, that's just one crucial point in Lewis's account of his grief. I'll leave it right there. Maybe I'll make another video. Maybe I won't. But that last thing that he said, those last few sentences, should obviously point you towards Gustafson's definition of grief.